Chapter 7, A Mad Tea Party. When Alice reached the March Hare's house, she found a tea table set out in front. The March Hare and the Mad Hatter were having a tea together. In the chair between them was a dormouse. He was fast asleep, and they were resting their elbows on him and talking over his head. The table was far too large for just three. Teacups and plates were set up at every place. Even so, the March Hare, the Mad Hatter, and the Dormouse were crammed together at one corner of the table. "No room, no room," they cried when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," Alice said. She sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. "Have some lemonade," the March Hare said. Alice looked around the table. All she saw was tea. "I don't see any lemonade," she said. "There isn't any," the March Hare said. "Then that wasn't very polite of you to offer it," Alice said angrily. "It wasn't very polite of you to sit down without being invited," said the March Hare. "Your hair wants cutting," the Hatter added. "You shouldn't be making personal remarks," Alice said. "It's rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide when she said this, but what he said to Alice was, "What day of the month is it?" He had taken out his pocket watch. He shook it and held it up to his ear. Alice tried to recall. "It's the 4th, she said. "My watch is 2 days wrong," sighed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't be good for it." He looked angrily at the March Hare. "It was the best butter," the March Hare said. "Yes, but some crumbs must have gotten in it as well," the Hatter grumbled. "You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife." The March Hare took hold of the watch. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea. Alice watched him with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she said. "It tells the day of the month, but it doesn't tell what o'clock it is." "Why should it?" the Hatter said. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?" "Of course not," said Alice. "But that's because it stays the same year for a long time." "Just like mine," the Hatter said. Alice was puzzled. "I don't quite understand," she said as politely as she could. "The Dormouse was still asleep," said the Hatter. He poured a little hot tea on his nose. The Dormouse shook his head, and without opening his eyes, he mumbled, "Of course, I was just going to say myself." The March Hare yawned. "I vote the young lady tell us a story." Alice was alarmed. "I'm afraid I don't know one," she said. "Then the Dormouse will," the March Hare and the Mad Hatter cried together, and they pinched the Dormouse on both sides. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. "I wasn't asleep," he said softly. "Tell us a story," the March Hare demanded. "Please do," Alice found herself saying. "And be quick about it," the Hatter added, "or you'll be asleep again before it's done." "Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began. Quickly, their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well. And what did they live on? Alice asked. She was always interested in questions of eating and drinking. "They lived on treacle," the Dormouse said. Alice was sure that treacle was sticky, sweet molasses. "They couldn't have lived on just that, you know," she said. "They would have been ill." "So they were," said the Dormouse. "Very ill." "But why did they live at the bottom of a well?" she asked. "Have some more tea," the March Hare said. "I haven't had any yet," Alice said, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less?" the Hatter said. "It's easy to take more than nothing." Alice didn't know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea. Then she asked the Dormouse again, "Why did they live at the bottom of a well?" The Dormouse took a minute or two to think about it. Then he said, "It was a treacle well." "There's no such thing," Alice burst out. "Shh," said the Hatter and the March Hare. "If you can't be polite, finish the story yourself," the Dormouse said, and he started to sulk. "No, please go on," Alice said. "I won't interrupt again, I promise." And so, the Dormouse continued, the 3 sisters were learning to draw. "What did they draw?" Alice asked. She had forgotten her promise already. "Treacle," the Dormouse said. "I want a clean cup," the Hatter announced. "Let's all move one place on." He moved to another chair, and the Dormouse followed, moving into the Hatter's chair, and the March Hare moved into the Dormouse's chair. Alice unwillingly took the chair out of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who had gained anything from the change. Alice was a good deal worse off than before, since the March Hare had just knocked the milk jug onto his plate. They were learning to draw, the Dormouse said, continuing the story. Then he yawned. Then he spoke again slowly. And they drew all sorts of things. Everything that begins with M. Why M? Alice asked. Why not? Said the March Hare. Alice kept silent. The Dormouse had closed his eyes. The Hatter pinched him and he woke with a little shriek. He went on drowsily. That begins with M, such as mousetraps and the moon and munchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of munchness? And if you ask me, I don't think, Alice started. Then you shouldn't talk, the Hatter said. His rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She stormed off in disgust, and she walked as far as she could away from the tea table, but they didn't call after her. They didn't seem to care she had gone. She looked back and saw the Hatter and the March Hare were trying to stuff the sleeping Dormouse into a teapot. That was the worst tea party I've ever been to in my whole life, Alice cried. As she said this, she noticed that one of the trees nearby had a door leading into it, and without another thought, she stepped inside. Once again, she found herself in a little hallway with a little door and the little key on the top of the table. She quickly unlocked the door and nibbled some of the mushrooms she kept in her pocket until she was perfect size to fit through, and at long last she went into the garden. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood at the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white. 3 gardeners, who looked like playing cards, were busy painting them red. Curious, Alice approached. Why are you painting those roses? She asked. 2 of the cards said nothing, but the 3rd card said in a low voice, You see, miss, this should have been a red rose tree, but we put a white one in by mistake. If the Queen finds out, we will lose our heads, you know. At this moment, the card next to him cried, The Queen! And the 3 gardeners threw themselves down on the ground, hiding their faces. Alice heard the sound of marching and turned excited to see the Queen. First came the soldiers wearing clubs. Next came the courtiers wearing diamonds. Then came the royal children, all wearing hearts. The guests came next. There were mostly kings and queens. Alice recognized the White Rabbit. He hurried by nervously, not noticing her. Then came the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a velvet cushion. And last of all came the King and Queen of Hearts. When Queen saw Alice, she stopped. Who's this? She asked the Knave of Hearts. He just smiled in return. Idiot! The Queen shrieked. She turned to Alice. What's your name, child? My name is Alice, your majesty. And who are they? The Queen asked. She was pointing to the 3 gardeners. They were still lying flat on the ground. Since they were lying on their faces, the patterns on their back was the same as the rest of the pack. The Queen could not tell if they were gardeners, soldiers, or 3 of her own children. How should I know? Alice asked. She was surprised at her own courage. The Queen turned crimson with fury. Off with her head, she cried. Nonsense, Alice said. The Queen's eyes blazed. Timidly, the King said to the Queen, My dear, she is only a child. The Queen turned away angrily. She ordered the 3 gardeners up. Well, then off with their heads, she shouted. The King and Queen moved on. When they were gone, Alice hid the gardeners in a large flower pot. Are their heads off? The Queen shouted behind her. The soldiers were so confused they couldn't find the gardeners. But to the Queen they replied, Their heads are gone, your majesty. That's right, the Queen shouted. Can you play croquet? The soldiers didn't answer. Instead, they turned to Alice. Clearly, the question was meant for her. Yes, shouted Alice. Come on, then, roared the Queen. So Alice walked with the rest of the royal guests toward the croquet field. The White Rabbit came up beside her. It's a very fine day, he said in a high, nervous voice. Very, Alice said. Where's the Duchess? Hush, the Rabbit said. Into her ear, he whispered, The Queen just put her in prison. Get to your places, the Queen said. The guests ran in all directions. Soon the game began. It was the most curious croquet game Alice had ever seen. Their croquet balls were hedgehogs. The mallets were live flamingos. The soldiers had to stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. Alice found the game rather difficult, mainly because she had a hard time controlling her flamingo. Every time she got it in position, it twisted its neck and looked at her with the oddest expression. She couldn't help but laugh. Plus, her hedgehog kept crawling away. and the soldiers were always walking around to and fro to different spots, so the arches were never in the same place. All the players played at the same time. They fought over hedgehogs, and soon the queen was stomping around. She was screaming, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head." Alice began to feel uneasy. What will become of me? They're dreadfully fond of getting rid of people's heads here. It's a wonder anyone has a head. She was looking for a way to escape when she noticed a curious shape in the air. It looked like a grin without a head attached. "Why, it's the Cheshire Cat," she said excitedly. "Now I'll have someone to talk to." "How are you getting on?" asked the cat as soon as he had enough of a mouth to speak with. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice complained when the cat's ears appeared. "How do you like the queen?" the cat asked. "Not at all," Alice said. "She's so extremely—" But then she noticed the queen right behind her, listening. "Likely to win, it's hardly worth finishing the game," Alice said. The queen smiled and walked on. "Who are you talking to?" the king asked Alice. He was standing beside her, and he gazed at the Cheshire Cat with great curiosity. "A friend of mine," Alice said. "A Cheshire Cat. Allow me to introduce you." "I'd rather not," the Cheshire Cat said. "Don't be rude," the king snapped. "This cat must be removed," he called to the queen. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen only had one way of doing that. "Off with its head," she shouted, without even looking over. But when a soldier arrived, there was an argument. Everyone turned to Alice to settle it. The soldier said, "You can't remove a head unless there's a body to remove it from." The king said anything with a head could be beheaded. And the queen said that if something wasn't done about it soon, she'd remove everyone's head. The crowd looked very nervous. Alice could think of nothing to say except, "The cat belongs to the Duchess. You better ask her about it." "But she's in prison," the queen said. The Cheshire Cat's head began to fade away. Soon the cat had vanished completely. The king and the soldiers ran around looking for it, but everyone else just shrugged and went back to playing croquet. Chapter 9. Who Stole the Tarts? Not much later, there was a cry in the distance. "The trial is starting," Alice heard. "What trial?" she thought, and she followed the crowd. Alice found the king and queen seated on their thrones. A crowd of little birds and beasts, as well as a whole pack of cards, was in the courtroom. The Knave of Hearts was standing before them in chains. The soldiers guarded him. The White Rabbit stood near the king. He had a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table with a huge tray of tarts on it. They looked delicious. Alice had never seen a courtroom before, but she had read about them in books. She knew there would be a judge. For this trial, it would be the king himself. Alice knew because he was wearing a powdered white wig. She also knew that there would be a jury box. And in this trial, the jury box was filled with 12 little creatures, a mix of different animals. The jurors had slates on which to write down different pieces of evidence. Some of the jurors were already writing, although there was nothing important to remember. One juror, Bill the Lizard, had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice could not stand. She crept behind him and snatched the pencil away. She did it so quickly that poor Bill had no idea what happened to it and was left to write with one finger for the rest of the day, which was very little use because it had made no mark on his slate. "Silence in the court," the White Rabbit called. "Read the charges," the king yelled. The White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on his trumpet. Then he unrolled the parchment scroll and began to read. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all in a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quite away." "Consider your verdict," the king told the jury. "Not yet," the rabbit interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "Call the first witness then," the king said. This was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. "I beg your pardon, your majesty, for bringing these things in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "You should have finished," the queen said. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court with the Dormouse. 14th of March, I think, the Hatter said. 15th of March, the March Hare said. 16th, said the Dormouse. "Write that down," the king told the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates. When they added them up, and some divided them into nonsense. "Take off your hat, the king told the hatter. It isn't mine, said the hatter. Stolen? Yelled the king. The jury wrote this down. I keep them to sell, the hatter explained. I have no hats of my own. I'm a hatter. Give your evidence, the king said, and don't be nervous or I'll have your head removed on the spot. But this made the hatter even more nervous. He looked anxiously at the queen. She stared back angrily. Nervously, the hatter bit a large piece of his teacup instead of his bread and butter. At this moment, Alice felt a curious thing. It seemed like she was growing. First, she thought she should get up and leave the courtroom, but on second thought, she decided to stay where she was as long as there was room for her. I wish you wouldn't squeeze so, said the Dormouse. He was sitting next to her. I can hardly breathe. I can't help it, Alice said. I'm growing. You have no right to grow here, the Dormouse snapped. Don't talk nonsense, Alice said. You're growing too. Yes, but I grow at a normal pace, not in a ridiculous fashion, the Dormouse said. He got up and moved to another seat. The hatter was still trying to give his evidence. Then the Dormouse said, the hatter was saying, and he glanced over at the Dormouse. He was fast asleep. After that, the hatter continued, I cut some more bread and butter. But what did the Dormouse say? A creature from the jury asked. That I can't remember, the hatter said. You must remember, the king said, or I'll have your head removed. The hatter dropped his teacup. He went down on one knee. He was shaking. I'm a poor man, your majesty, he pleaded. You're a very poor speaker, the king said. If that's all you have to say, you might as well stand down. I can't go any lower, the hatter protested. I'm on the floor now as it is. Then you may sit down, the king said. The hatter rushed out of the court without another word. Just take his head off outside, the queen told one of the soldiers. But the hatter was out of sight before the soldier could reach him. Call the next witness, the king called. The next witness was the Duchess cook. She was carrying Pepper with her, and everyone sneezed as she entered the court. Give your evidence, the king said. Won't, the cook replied. The king crossed his arms. He frowned at her. What were the tarts made of? He asked the cook. Pepper mostly, the cook said at once. Treacle, a sleepy voice said nearby. Remove the Dormouse's head, the queen shrieked in excitement. Turn the Dormouse out of court. Pinch him. Off with his whiskers. For some minutes, the whole court was in confusion. By the time they made the Dormouse leave, the cook had disappeared. Never mind, the king said. Call the next witness. Alice watched as the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list. She was very curious to see who the next witness would be, and she was very surprised when the White Rabbit read out in a loud, shrill voice, Alice. Chapter 10, Alice's Evidence. Here, Alice cried. She had forgotten how large she had gotten. When she jumped up, she knocked over the jury box, and the creatures in the jury fell out on their heads. Oh, I beg your pardon, Alice exclaimed. She picked them up as quickly as she could. When all the jurors were back in their box, Alice approached the witness stand. What do you know about this? The king asked. Nothing, Alice said. Nothing at all, the king insisted. Nothing at all, Alice said. That's very important, the king said, turning to the jury, and they wrote it down. The White Rabbit spoke up. Unimportant, your majesty means, of course, he said. Unimportant, of course, the king said. That's what I meant. Important, unimportant, important, unimportant, important. He went on as if trying to see which word he liked best. Some of the creatures in the jury wrote down one word, some wrote down the other. Alice could see this. But it doesn't matter a bit, she thought. The king called out, Silence! And he read aloud from his book. Rule 42, all persons more than a mile high must leave the court. Everybody looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, she protested. You are, the king said. I won't go, Alice said. Besides, it's not a real rule. It's the oldest rule in the book, the king said. Then that would be rule number 1, Alice said. The king turned very pale. He shut his book. Consider your verdict, he told the jury. The White Rabbit jumped up, waving a piece of paper. There's more evidence, your majesty, he announced. A letter written by the prisoner, the Knave of Hearts, to somebody. Well, it must be to somebody, the king said, unless it was written to nobody. The White Rabbit opened the envelope. It's not a letter, your majesty, it's a poem. Please, your majesty, the Knave of Hearts called out. I didn't write it. They can't prove I did. There's no name signed at it. The king thought for a moment. If you didn't sign it, that only makes it worse. You should have signed your name like an honest man, unless you wanted to make mischief. The crowd applauded. It was the first clever thing the king had said all day. That proves his guilt, of course, the queen said. So off with his... It doesn't prove anything of the sort, Alice interrupted. She had grown so large she couldn't speak out at all. She wasn't afraid to speak out at all. Hold your tongue, the queen shouted. I won't, Alice said. Off with her head, the queen screamed at the top of her lungs. Nobody moved. Who cares for you, Alice said. She had grown to her full height by now. You're nothing but a pack of cards. All the cards rose up in the air. They flew straight at Alice, and she screamed. She tried to beat them off and found herself lying on the riverbank, her head in her sister's lap. Her sister was gently brushing some leaves away that had fallen from the tree upon her face. Wake up, Alice, dear, her sister was saying. Alice opened her eyes. Oh, I had such a curious dream, Alice said, and she told her sister every single thing she could remember. She had had the most wonderful adventures, but they had seemed so real, it was hard to believe it had only been a dream.